Hi, wonderful people. I'm Leah. As a sociologist, University of Melbourne professor, founder of the Gender Equity Initiative, director of the Future of Work Lab, woman, wife, and mother, I've made it my life's mission to take down every ridiculous gender myth out there. Together, we'll deep dive into the research to get to the bottom of all these misperceptions that are holding all of us back. Don't worry, I've studied these types of questions for decades, and after publishing countless articles exactly on these topics, I know when they are nonsense or real truths. And I'm going to help you learn that too. So here we go. Let's do it. This is Misperceived. On today's episode, I'm going to help you unpack the misperception. Is it in fact a misperception that our attitudes towards women's roles are becoming more equal over time? Before I start this episode, I just want to give you a trigger warning. This episode is going to discuss attitudes and support for abortion. So if you don't want to listen, this is your opportunity to dip out. Let me ask you your opinion on these questions. Do you agree or disagree with the following statements? And if you do, is it a strong disagreement or is it a weak disagreement? Like, do you strongly agree or do you strongly disagree? Are you ready? I have 4. The first is, do you agree or disagree with the statement that most men are better suited emotionally for politics than are most women? Do you agree or disagree with the statement, it is much better for everyone involved if the man is the achiever outside the home and the woman take care of the home and family? How about this statement? A working mother can establish just as warm and secure a relationship with her children as a mother who does not work. And the final one? A preschool child is likely to suffer if his or her mother works. How do you feel about these statements? Do you agree? Do you disagree? And is it strong or is it weak? The reason I'm asking you this is these are the ways that social scientists ask for people's attitudes about women's roles in family and public life. And we've used these questions, this battery of questions, for decades to study whether people are becoming more equal in their perceptions of women in public life and in home life or less. So what do you think is happening with these questions and how Americans are responding to these questions over time? Do you think it's changed? Do you think people are more supportive of mothers working outside the home or mothers entering politics? Or do you think that these gender norms are shifting towards more traditionalism? And what do you think this looks like generationally? Like when you think about these questions, how would you answer them? And then how would you expect, say, someone a generation up to answer them or someone 2 up, your grandparents, your mother, your aunties, your uncles? Do you think that these responses to these questions are changing over time? So in this episode of Misperceived, I'm going to ask you this question. Are these gender norms getting more progressive over time? Are we becoming more equal in how we view men and women's roles? Or is there a slide? Let me paint a picture for you. I want you to understand that one of the biggest changes in the past 50 years has been the incredible rise of women into higher education, employment, and political power. I want to be crystal clear. We are in no ways done. We still have gender inequality, and we have not reached parity. We have not reached equality. But the rise of women and that shift over the past 50 years has been tremendous. It's seismic. Let me give you some stats to tell you what I'm saying. In 1950, only 24% of all the bachelor degrees that were awarded went to women. That means 76% went to men. By 2022, women are getting 58% of the bachelor degrees. And in fact, women are getting more education at all levels than men. They're getting more of the bachelor's degrees. They're getting more of the master's degrees. They're getting more of the doctorates. We have one of the most highly educated group of women in all of history. And women are now getting more education than men at all levels. 1950 is not the case. When we look at employment, we see the same pattern. We see in 1950 that 30% of the workforce was women, of the total workforce, right? That means 70% was men. In the year 2000, that's 46%. So women are almost half of the total workforce. And the census is predicting that by 2050, that'll be about 48%. So by 2050, we'll almost be equal. Half the workforce will be women and half the workforce will be men. So that's an incredible rise in women's employment. And when we look to women's power, we look from 1950s, there were 11 to 17 women in Congress. And I mean across the Senate and the House. There's 535 seats. And so what that means was women in Congress in 1950 accounted for between 2 and 4% of the total political power. Now, in 2023, we see 151 women. That's 28%. That's pretty far from 50. And there's a lot of room to go in terms of women's political power. But what I want to say to you is women are on an incredible march and meteoric rise in terms of their participation in education, employment, and political power. It's not at parity, but these shifts are significant. They're seismic. They're incredible. And what we've had is this rise of women in higher education, employment, and power. And what you can see from this is that as you have more women enter positions of power, attitudes change. We start to see that women are more valuable in public life, that they should be in public life. And we start to see less agreement that their only place is in the home. And as attitudes change, more women enter, right? It's a cycle. So it's going in both directions. So this is that kind of question of what's happening to gender role attitudes over time. Are we becoming more progressive as a country, or are they stalled? And what does this mean for women more broadly? And what does this mean for generations, right? Is it actually just that generations are becoming more progressive? So I'm going to talk to you today about an article written by one of my favorite humans and colleague, William Buddy Scarborough. So Buddy did a whole PhD on this shifting attitudes. And in one of his articles with Buddy and Barbara Risman that was published in Gender and Society, what they did was they took the data from the General Social Survey from 1977 through to 2016. And they were interested in seeing how Americans' attitudes to those statements I read to you at the start changed over time. Do we see that women should be in politics? Do we see that women should be in the home? Do children suffer if women work? And they were interested in seeing, does each generation become more progressive than the last? What they find is that there is an increase in the number of people who are more egalitarian or people who are more supportive of women entering into public life. So yes, women make just as good politicians as men. And yes, women should work when their kids are little. And no, their children won't suffer. So there is this shift. There's more people moving into this group or this category. And the result of that is that there are fewer people sitting in the more traditional category where they would say, no, women don't make good politicians, or no, women shouldn't be working, or yes, children suffer when women do work. And so that group of traditionals has declined. But the question is, has that group of traditionals declined because they've moved into that more kind of, yes, we're supporting in women's areas, or do we see this new form of traditional emerge? The answer is, they see a new form of traditionalism emerge. What they find is that rather than these people going from being traditional on these to kind of egalitarian or progressive on them, what they see is there's this kind of fracture. There's two groups that emerge. The largest group is a group that thinks that women, yes, would make good politicians, but that children do suffer when mothers work outside the home. So this group is kind of saying, yeah, political power, but there's a consequence for the home. And this is the bigger of the two groups. The second group is much smaller. It's only about 10% of the sample. And what they're saying is, actually, men are better politicians, but it's okay for women to work and the kids won't suffer. Now, this group is kind of interesting because that feels a little bit different, right? And one of the things they talk about is how this is tied to unemployment rates, that if you are a person who has difficulty accessing jobs, that maybe you say, okay, yeah, we do need to work, but I want a man in political power. Maybe women don't make good politicians. And so what they're seeing is that Americans are becoming more progressive, more gender equal over time, but the composition of the groups look different. There's fewer traditionals. There's a movement towards this more egalitarian, but then there is this new traditionalism that is emerging. What I want you to take from this is this idea that gender norms are becoming more complicated. Whereas perhaps 50 years ago or in 1970 or 1950, you could expect that people were either really progressive on this stuff. They were either saying women should be everywhere, politics, employment, out of the home, or no, they shouldn't. And what's happening is there's complexity going on. It's the idea that, yes, women are good in some areas, but maybe there's consequences in others. And the reason I'm talking to you about this is that I've done some work around gender roles and gender expectations and what that means for support for abortion. So this work was done with one of my best friends of all time, Kelsey Kretschmer, and her equally wonderful husband, Chris Stout, at Oregon State University. And our paper was published in Gender and Society last year. So we were interested in asking women in the US, to what extent do you agree with the following statements? I'm going to read them to you. So think about this. Do you agree with these? I am glad to be a woman. I often think about the fact that I'm a woman. Being a woman is an important part of how I see myself. I have a lot in common with the average woman, and women have a lot in common with each other. So for this question, we're asking about how central is womanhood to your identity? Do you think that being a woman is an important part of your identity as a woman, as a person? Do you see gender as an important part of your identity? And then we asked them this other question, and this question is about gender-linked fate. Now, in research, there's this idea that certain groups see that their futures and fates are tied to each other. That if things go well for you as a woman, things will go well for me as a woman. Or if things go poorly for you as a woman, things will go poorly for me as a woman. This linked fate idea has been used to understand why Black women tend to vote as a consistent bloc in the US, in part because what can happen for another person of color like me will have serious consequences for me. And so there's this literature that shows that there's this really high sense of linked fate, in particular amongst Black women in the US. And it helps explain why, even though they can come from a range of diverse backgrounds, they vote as a consistent bloc. We were interested in, could you see the same parallel for gender-linked fate? Do women see themselves as connected to other women? And we asked them this question. How much do you think that what happens generally to women in this country will impact what happens in your life? And the options were none, a little, some, or a lot. And this is capturing gender-linked fate. And what we were interested in doing is understanding if you have a strong gender identity, this idea that I see me as a woman as being important, and you have a strong sense of linked fate, do either of those predict your support for things like the Me Too movement or abortion? And what we found was that women, whether they were Black or white, whether they were sitting across the political spectrum, that they were reporting really strong agreements to the statements about the importance of being a woman in their life. They said, yes, my gender identity, the fact that I'm a woman, is really important. But only the more progressive women saw that their futures or fates were tied to other women. And this explained why they were supportive of abortion and the Me Too movement. Said another way, those who were less progressive, those who were more conservative, did not necessarily say that their futures or fates were connected to other women. And because of that, they reported less support for abortion. They reported less support for the Me Too movement. And what was interesting is we've done a bunch of research on this. We've looked at that gender-linked fate question, and what we found is it's a really good predictor of whether women see their futures and fates as tied to other women, whether they support abortion and Me Too, and that in particular, when they marry, that they tend to report less gender-linked fate for white women. And when they're divorced, they report more. So there is this thing about how my life circumstances around me impact whether I see myself as connected to other women. Now, I want to just point this out that we did this study before the fall of Roe versus Wade. So of course our results might have changed. But I want to know that women across the political spectrum, they have this strong sense of womanhood. It's seen as a main part of their identity. They're proud to be a woman, but they don't necessarily see what happens to other women as impacting what happens to their own life. That becomes politically divided. And so this sense of gender-linked fate is not a given. So is it actually a misperception that gender norms are getting more progressive over time? Well, not really. Gender norms are getting more progressive, and people are valuing women's role in politics and employment. And yes, each generation is more supportive of the last. But it's important to say that there's these fissures that are happening, that progressive attitudes aren't moving together, that there's ways in which people can say, yes, it's important for me to be a woman. Yes, it's important to have women in politics. but I'm traditional at home, and then I maybe don't see my future and fate as tied to other women. And so this kind of dispersion means that political outcomes are going to continue to be complicated because our gender identities and our attitudes about women's roles are tied to a range of things. They're tied to religion, they're tied to gender. They can also be tied to racial attitudes. So if we assume that our worlds work in these very simple ways, we will continue to be wrong. We also have research showing that mothers who experience more disruption during the pandemic in their childcare and their employment were more likely to say that their futures and fates were connected to other women. So this may be true as more women experience different health outcomes because of restrictions to abortion. And so what I'm trying to say is that the experiences of women are complex, that they're changing, and they're impactful. And all of this may shift quickly. Attitudes may start to shift more quickly in light of these big political changes. So more research is essential. And our research is here to kind of fill that gap. I can talk to you more about what we're doing live and in the moment. As per always, thank you so much for listening to Misperceived, where you don't need a PhD, but you just get to come hang out with me. This podcast was produced with the support of the incredible Sophie Squires, the wonderful Kate Danger, the fantastic Rich Berner, and the one and only, the best ever made, Serena Reagan. I would like to acknowledge that our podcast is recorded on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people listening today.